panel. I want to thank you for joining us today as we continue the surrounding mental health, as we continue the conversation surrounding mental health and racism. Between the global pandemic and the recent uptick in systemic violence against the Black community, this is certainly a time fraught with turmoil, and it shows in the mental health of our marginalized populations. In a given year, 1 in 5 adults in the US experiences mental illness. However, a recent study from the CDC found that nearly 41% of respondents reported mental illness issues in June. Calls to NAMI's helpline have increased by 65%. 7 in 10 American teenagers are struggling with their mental health, and Black children are more than twice as likely to die by suicide than their white peers. But mental health concerns in Black individuals are not news by any means. In 2018 survey, a 2018 survey showed that nearly 5 million African Americans with a mental illness, close to 70% had not received treatment, and suicide is the 3rd leading cause of death among Black men. Why is this? Well, in September, we opened up this conversation, and we're excited for the opportunity to continue it today and work towards mental health for all. So I'd like to introduce to you today our panelists. Joining us today are Pastor Chuck Mingo, teaching pastor for Crossroads Church, Dr. Danielle Johnson, psychiatrist at the Linder Center of Hope, and Robert Lomax, Hamilton County Deputy Sheriff. Thank you all so much for being here today and for this important conversation. Let's kick things off with our 2020 Excellence in Mental Health Award winner, Dr. Danielle Johnson.
Hello, everyone.
Dr. Johnson, between the pandemic and the recent social unrest, how has the mental health of Black Americans been impacted?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me this afternoon. Well, first, let's start with the pandemic. This is our 9th month of COVID-19. And of course, it's impacting everyone, but Black Americans have been impacted differently, partly because of the economic impacts of COVID-19. As we know, Black Americans, for the most part, are still economically disadvantaged, don't make as much money as white Americans, are employed in more frontline jobs. Their jobs have been impacted in different ways. So some people have had their hours cut, more people have been laid off, and some people have had to make the decision, especially in households where there's only the mom in the household or only the dad in the household, and then their kids are now schooling from home. Do I go to work or do I stay home and educate my children? So some people have had to stop working so that they can make sure their children are educated. So because of the pandemic, people are either working less or completely unemployed now. So Black Americans compared to white Americans have had 2 to 3 times the economic impact, negative economic impact since the pandemic. And then in general, we know that having financial stress is a risk factor for depression and other psychiatric symptoms such as anxiety, insomnia, stress, and that was pre-pandemic. So now with the fear of losing your job, not having your needs met because you can't pay your bills, and then the fear of potentially losing your job if you haven't already lost it, there's even more of an impact on your mental health. So there's been a few surveys and studies since the pandemic has occurred, and 54% of people who lost their job since the pandemic have reported that they've had a negative impact on their mental health, compared to 40% who did not lose their job. And then compared to 29% of white people, 39% of Black people during the pandemic have reported symptoms of stress, anxiety, or sadness. And then people who are in a lower income compared to people in a higher income, 44% compared to 26% have reported again stress, anxiety, or sadness. So again, just the financial impact of COVID-19 has had a serious impact on mental health. And then not only that, because of social isolation, you know, we're supposed to be social distancing, there's curfews, there's quarantine, and you don't have your social supports. For communities of color and immigrant communities, we tend to rely on our extended family for social support. Now, when you don't have that, you have an impact or higher feelings of loneliness because of social isolation. So when you don't have your support system, you're going to have higher symptoms of depression and anxiety. So that's another way that the pandemic has impacted Black Americans. And then not only dealing with, so the economic impact, the impact of social isolation, and then we're dealing with the health impact. So Black Americans are impacted, the housing. So tending to live in housing where you're in closer quarters and you can't social distance, working in occupations where you are around more people and more likely to be around people and contract COVID-19. And then if you do get COVID-19, you might not have the same resources to get treated. So according to the CDC, and these numbers I'm looking at to make sure I get them right. So Black Americans, 1.4 times the number of cases, and 2.8 times the number of deaths, and 3.7 times the number of hospitalizations compared to white Americans. So with that significant increase, when you have your family members, your friends, your community having such high rates, more grief, more stress, more depression, more anxiety, more trauma. So that's how COVID-19 has impacted Black Americans in different ways than the rest of the population. And then on top of that, then we're dealing with social unrest. So while the pandemic is going on, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, among others, all of this happening at the same time. So we're dealing with COVID-19, and then we're inundated with all these images on the news and on social media of all of these things happening. Even if you don't want to look at it, it's in your face all the time. So this repeated trauma. And then the protests that are happening at the same time. And then you see on the news, peaceful protesters with skirmishes with police and with counter protesters. So that's repeated trauma that you're seeing. And so it's just trauma upon trauma upon trauma. There have been a couple of studies even prior to COVID that showed that Black adults who live in a state where there have been a police shooting of a Black American have more negative mental health days than white Americans who live in that same state. And then when they're exposed to another police shooting, more negative mental health days. And then Black adolescents who have been exposed to viewing videos again on social media or the news of a police shooting or someone getting beaten of their same race, the more repeated trauma these teenagers are getting symptoms of depression and PTSD. So again, repeated exposure to the trauma has a negative impact on mental health. So
I want to build on that.
Yes, please.
No, I want
You're
to build
welcome.
on that. Pastor Chuck, how can one build resilience in the face of this racial trauma?
Yeah, I just want to also echo Dr. Johnson. Thank you so much for having me be part of this. Excited to have this conversation. And Dr. Johnson illustrated what I think we all know, which is that there's a collective level of PTSD that's been experienced by every American, no matter your race. But then on top of that, particularly for the Black community, there's another level of PTSD. And so in a time like this, how do you build resilience? So I'll share a couple things and would love to get some other dialogue going with Dr. Johnson and also Robert and you as well, Eugene. You know, as I think about this moment, I think about this term that I love called soul care. And what I mean by soul care is really how do we care for our inner selves in a time when externally there are so many things that are competing for either our attention or quite frankly, for our focus, because they're in flux. And two things come to mind. First, for me, as I think about that, I think about something that I would call the Sabbath principle. And while that's a spiritual concept that shows up in many of the faiths that might be represented on the call, you also see the Sabbath principle playing out whenever there are times of war. In a time of war, there is a tour of duty. And after that tour of duty, people roll off of the front lines and they get a time to rest. And I think that in some ways, 2020 has felt like you're constantly on that battlefield. And so one of the things that we have to do is find Sabbath places of rest, days of rest, 1 in 7, ways that we rest, whether that be exercise or something that we like to do creatively. Those kinds of things I think are really important. And it can seem in a year like this where there's not time for that, there's not resources for that. But I would argue it's in these kinds of times that kind of Sabbath principle becomes even more important. And then the other thing is we need to find solidarity. We need safe spaces with safe people where we can process what's going on. Obviously, that's one of the things that NAMI provides to our community, is a place for people to process in relationship some of the hardships and challenges that are shared by other people. And I know in my life this year, what has sustained me in times of uncertainty and difficulty and pain has been that. It's been those safe spaces and safe people where I can be angry if I'm angry, where I can lament if I need to lament, where I can creatively think about how to move past or be in this challenging time that we find ourselves in. And I do think that those are ways that we build resilience, this Sabbath principle of rest and safe spaces and safe people.
I definitely agree with you. That idea of needing a safe space to express yourself, and that could be in anger, that could be in fear, but I think that's something that's extremely important to dealing with the mental illness, or just dealing with that post-traumatic stress that you talk about, is something that I don't think a lot of our white counterparts understand. When you grow up in a situation where it's constant, and Dr. Johnson said it best, it's tragedy after tragedy, chronic stress, chronic stress. And I don't think we always know that we're dealing with it. And you need a safe place, and you need individuals that you can speak to kind of release and make sure that they understand how you're feeling, and you can let those feelings go in a safe area. Anybody else want to add on to any of that?
I have to agree totally with what Pastor Mingo was talking about, the safe place. And I began to think about when you were talking about chronic stress, when you're used to dealing with stress every day, you don't even know that it's chronic. For some people, it's like, this is really you, and finding that safe place and learning how to decompress and to do the things that will allow your mind and body to kind of settle really does help with your mental focus.
Hey, thinking about that, Mr. Robert, when you talk about just mental illness in itself, just as a deputy sheriff, how do you see mental illness manifest itself day to day in your work?
Good question. First of all, I want to say thank you for letting me be a part of this wonderful panel of people and presenters and talkers today. So I'm really enjoying every bit of this. I'm in my role, what I do, in Hamilton County, I'm basically a technician. So I deal with the first people that come in when they're first arrested and brought into the center. And I take the pictures. I'm hands-on dealing with that person. So I'm a civil servant with Hamilton County. So I just want to stress that my views are my views, not theirs. But basically, I've been seeing a lot of stress induced situations. And to get back to your question, we have a lot of mental illness out, just on the street. People are being arrested. And especially around this time of year, it gets a little colder outside. It's been my observation that some people, sometimes they get arrested to come into jail. If they have a safe place, it's cold, it's warm in here, they can get 3 meals a day, different things like that might happen, and they'll get the care and the medication that they need at the time. So we have quite often repeat offenders that it's obvious that there are mental health issues when they come in, and then they're dealing with they have the same type of issues and they need a certain amount of care when they come into this facility.
Okay.
Did I kind of answer your question there, or?
No, yes, you did. Yes, you did, definitely. I'm gonna jump over to Dr. Johnson though. Hey, Dr. Johnson, can you tell us about disparities in the mental health care field for African Americans or Black Americans?
Yes, and I can actually start by piggybacking on Robert's answer. For Black Americans with mental illness and substance use disorders, they are disproportionately treated in the criminal justice system. In
Yes.
America, the criminal justice system is the largest provider of mental health treatment. So just keep that fact in your head. That should not be the case. So
Exactly.
yeah, a large proportion of Black people in the criminal justice system have mental illness. So we'll start there. So that is a staggering, I don't have the number right in front of me, but it's very high. It's a very high statistic.
It's very staggering. And I tell you, I mean, when you have to deal with it on a daily basis, young Black men and women that come in with these cases, you know that it's there, but how are you dealing with them? How are we actually dealing with them? We're just taking them through the process, holding them a couple of days, and then putting them back on the street. You know, there has to be more that needs to be done.
Yes, it's a broken system. Yeah.
Yes, definitely more.
Yes.
And do
Yes.
we think a lot of this goes unnoticed, or, you know, mental illness is taking place and a lot of undiagnosed issues, and it just kind of manifests itself, and that's where they find themselves. I know with drug abuse and also incarceration, we find that, and a lot of it, I guess, stems from things that weren't discussed, touched, or even found when you were at a younger age.
Yeah.
Well, I also want to say, I think we have to just own the broken reality of our country's narrative around race and criminal justice, and recognize that we need look no further than the way that heroin has been treated here in the 2000s versus the way that crack cocaine was positioned in earlier times in our country. One was highly criminalized.
Yes, sir.
And one obviously was highly concentrated in the Black community, whereas the other one was seen as a healthcare crisis. And I think that that's also part of what plays into these systems and how people are treated. I'm originally from Philadelphia, and just a couple months ago, there was an incident with the Philadelphia police where there was a gentleman who had a mental distress. He was in mental distress, and he wound up losing his life at the hands of the police. And I thought the way that that family responded was a really powerful statement, because rather than them demonize the police, what they said is the system has not set up the criminal justice people, the police, to understand how to deal with this mental health crisis. And so I think we've got to start asking different and bigger questions about this disparity that we see in terms of how mental health is maybe framed one way with one group of people, but in the Black community is often criminalized.
Right. And back to the disparities issue, comparing, Black Americans getting treatment versus white Americans. For people who have mental health issues, about 50% of white Americans get treatment and about 30% of Black Americans do. And then when Black people go in to get treatment, they tend to get inpatient treatment versus white Americans start out with outpatient treatment. So that's showing that Black people don't get treatment until their illness is at a severity where they need inpatient treatment, or when they get treatment, they tend to go to the emergency room or primary care instead of specialized mental health treatment. And then presenting to treatment, there's the issue of bias of mental health providers or primary care, whoever they're seeing. There's still provider bias. There is the, historical trauma of, being scared to go see a provider.
Right.
One big issue is that particularly for Black men, when Black men present with a mood disorder like depression or bipolar disorder, it's often misdiagnosed as a psychotic disorder. So then it's mistreated as well. And as I mentioned, a lot of times getting treated inappropriately, often not offered the most evidence-based treatment, getting the wrong medication. And then there's, when people do want to get treatment, stigma. It's still in our community seen as a weakness, just something you should pray about, and absolutely nothing wrong with that. But when someone has a severe mental illness, you need your faith community, you need your family, you need your friends, and you need medical treatment as well. You need multiple layers of protection. So there's just a lot of issues. You know, more Black people are uninsured or underinsured, so they don't have access to treatment. So there's just a number of roadblocks to the way of Black people getting mental health treatment.
And I want to jump on what Pastor Mingo said when he talked about the situation that happened in Philadelphia. I know for many in the Black community, the idea of calling the police to deal with a situation, just like that family, the thing that was, I think that for a lot of us, we looked at it and said, that's why I don't call the police. We had a situation that was taking place where somebody was clearly in mental distress, the parents, the family, they all said it. But when the police came, they didn't come and they didn't have the tools to deal with that type of situation. And rather than pulling out, say, having a conversation or de-escalating techniques, you know, it went straight to a weapon, and then someone was killed. And I think for us, you know, we talk about bias, we talk about the stigma, but it's the fear. For me, it's the fear of calling the police to come deal with a situation at my house, dealing with my sons or my daughters. And when the police come, we want help, but then one of my loved ones, they end up dead. And how do I deal with that? So when you want to talk about trauma and chronic, you know, stress, deal with that situation of that family and that parent who called for help and ended up feeling like they were the reason that that loved one was killed. And I think that's something for us to deal with. And I know as we deal with the criminal justice system and look for reform, and even the mental, as far as dealing with mental illness and preparing our police officers, that right there is something that we have to look at and continue to look at.
Yes.
Whew, okay, all right.
I just want to put a quick plug in for those who live in Hamilton County. You can call the mobile crisis team and not call the police. Hamilton County does have a mobile crisis team. So just be aware of that.
Definitely, we use that a lot in the school system. So I definitely would agree with that. Definitely try to reach out to the mobile crisis unit. And hopefully at the end of this, maybe we can put that number even up on for individuals who are tuning in. I'm gonna keep the conversation moving. I'm gonna go back with Mr. Lomax. As a Black man who works in the Justice Center, dealing with incarcerated individuals, what's your personal, and again, we know that you don't speak for all, this is personal, but what's your personal perspective and experience with police brutality and subsequent protests that's taken place?
My experience has been very broad. Like I said, I see them right from the beginning when things happen. And I have to say, from my perspective, I have not seen some severe cases. In every group, there's a bad apple, and you know who they are. You know the personalities of these people when they come through, in where I work. And I would have to say, for the most part, the people that I work around are there to help and to facilitate that person while they've been arrested, whatever the case is going to be. And like you said earlier, making sure that people deal with their own bias is really one of the biggest things that you can do when working with someone in the area that I work in. I don't have time to judge someone because of what they've been arrested for. I need to make sure that they are being cared for and taken care of and moved on through the process so that they can move on to the next level. So I've seen some mishandling because of someone's bias, or they might have spoken a certain way, or even when you're dealing with physical touch, because some people don't want that type of, treatment. And you have to learn how to talk and communicate and facilitate and to really work with people who may be in a panic situation or had never been arrested before, but they're feeling some great anxiety, or I've had many cases like that. And just really, it's kind of an observation from my perspective, but you really have to take time to really find out what's going on with that person at the time, and not just be so quick to be aggressive or talk in a certain manner. And like you said, how people view law enforcement is how Blacks view law enforcement. There's positive and there's negative. and they don't trust. The trust is not there that this person is out for my well-being. This person is gonna take care of this situation.
Okay, this is something for the other panelists. Do you all think with everything that's going on as far as the unrest, do you think more of individuals who look like us, African Americans, are going to be drawn to law enforcement, or are we going to run from law enforcement? Are we going to have more individuals trying to get in academies and whatnot? What's your feeling or thoughts around that?
I hope there will be more, but I don't know. I hope there will be more though.
Yeah, I would agree.
Go ahead.
I would agree. And I was going to say, I also would encourage, that's the place where put people on this call right now, we can take ownership. I think it's really important that in this moment, we recognize that we can't find the reform that we want if we only choose to work outside of the systems that in many ways may oppress us. But if we think about the history and the legacy of the civil rights movement, we think about people like Whitney Young, there were always people who were willing to step inside the systems. I think about you, Eugene, who you're a superintendent of a school district. You're in the system. And so you can affect powerful change in a way that none of us can on the outside of the system. So I want to just encourage people on this call to recognize that, Brian Stevenson wrote the great book, Just Mercy. He talks about getting proximate to the problems we're trying to solve. I would encourage all of us to make that a part of the strategy, part of the way that we talk in our communities. We got to get proximate to these problems. We can't just only advocate or agitate from the outside and expect the change we want to see.
And it's interesting, you said I'm drawn to a conversation I had with another superintendent, Marlon Stiles from Middletown. And we were in a conversation and we're dealing with public funding and ed choice. And one of the conversations that we talked about is that the ed choice or voucher program is really affecting the minority communities. And he actually had a plea and it made sense. And what he said was, when we start speaking to legislators, it can't just be us. It can't be other African, Marlon Stiles, African-American male, but it can't be people that look like us. We need other individuals to pick that up and also step out and have their voices heard. So again, I make a plea to anyone that's on the call, and that's dealing with when you see something wrong, they say, speak on it, act on it. And I encourage everyone to definitely take an active role in dealing with situations, wrong, and differences in the community. But although we have a panel of African Americans, if we're going to make a true hit, or we're really going to affect change, we're going to need all of us, people from all different walks of life, economic backgrounds, racial, ethnic backgrounds, to take a step forward and speak their mind. And that's true change. And I'm actually starting to see a lot of that take place. It's interesting in the school system where a lot of my teachers, after the unrest was taking place, we had some phenomenal conversations around biases and individuals who, I'll just say, 50 years of age that had no idea that white privilege even existed. And their eyes are being opened and conversations are being had. So I hope that this continues. And again, I would encourage everyone that's on this call to definitely be a part of what's going on and be an active participant in it. So,
it's interesting that you would say that. My mind took me back to when we had some unrest here in Cincinnati, and I actually had a chance to actually talk to some of the people who were arrested during the protests, and a lot of them were Caucasian, and they were young people that weren't afraid to speak up. And when we talk about allyship, there was that connectedness. I mean, though they could not say that they knew what it felt to be a Black person or to be treated that way, there was a sense of connection that we have to say something, we have to do something to get someone's attention. And so it's interesting that you would mention that.
I'm gonna jump, Pastor Chuck, these panels were sparked by the recent killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many more tragic deaths in the Black community. As we just touched on with Robert, when we had he just said it, he said, why is allyship, and I hope I got it right, allyship, not necessarily a good posture for Caucasian people to assume in this conversation? Can you explain that?
I can, yeah. I'd love to talk about that. And that may be, people might be saying, what? Like, no, we need allies. Well, hear me out. I think allyship is a good start, but it's not the final destination. And I'm really in debt to a Jewish friend of mine, Dr. Martin Friedman, for giving me this perspective. When I am an ally to your suffering, it means that I am observing your suffering. I may be coming next to your suffering, but here's what needs to happen when it comes to racism and its effects. We have to get to a point where we recognize that racism hurts all of us. It doesn't just hurt people of color. It hurts our white brothers and sisters as well. And so there is something that happens when we move from sympathy, which is like allyship, I'm alongside your pain, to empathy. Empathy means inside. I am inside your pain. I'm making your struggle my struggle. I'm making your suffering my suffering. And when that happens, all of a sudden, we get way more creative in solving problems. And the story that I would use to illustrate that is, my wife and I had 3 kids. Can you imagine if I said, when my wife was pregnant, I'm an ally to my wife's pregnancy. I'm an ally to her pregnancy. Now, granted, I can't carry a child. I'm not going to give birth. But my wife was looking for a little bit more than me just standing next to her, right? She was looking for a little bit more skin in the game as it relates to being a father and coming alongside her in that process. And I think the same has to happen in this struggle with race. And I'll give you an interesting example. You know, most people on this call may remember a time when you walked into a restaurant, the first question you got asked was smoking or not. And you know what really changed the game on that? First of all, think about when's the last time that was the first question you were asked in a restaurant. You probably can't recall it. And what changed the game when it came to smoking in our society was something called secondhand smoke. When the science began to indicate that smoking doesn't just harm the smoker, but it harms everyone, within years, we literally changed the trajectory of smoking and the impact that it had in our society. And I would like to believe that the same could be true in this moment in 2020 as it relates to racism. If we can recognize that racism hurts everyone and move beyond allyship to empathy, I wonder what we can change in terms of these systems and these structures and the disparities that we see in the next generation. I'm excited about that. I'm giving my life to that. And it makes me hopeful, even in a time and a year like this, where it doesn't seem like there's a lot of hope to be found.
Anybody like to add on?
No, I think that is a good perspective to have. And I think that in addition to going beyond allyship, I think what people need to understand, that going beyond that and having that empathy, that means that not only recognizing that there is white privilege, but you have to be able to be willing to let go of your white privilege. That you're okay with, I'm okay with not having this anymore. And I think that that's the difficulty that some people have to face with accepting that there is white privilege. But in order to allow other people who don't have that to have some equal standing with me, I have to let go of some of that. And I think that's where a lot of the difficulty that we're facing right now in this country comes from. So that, I think that is one of the biggest struggles or obstacles that we're going to have right now.
I'm definitely seeing that connectedness. I think you spoke on it with young folks, Mr. Lomax, Robert, when you talked about, you know, it was a lot of young Caucasians that were taking part of this and being involved in everything that was taking place. I think that's that means a lot that we're seeing this younger, this fearless, I'll just say fearless younger generation that's coming up. I remember during the Rodney King beating and trials, I was at the University of Cincinnati, and I remember being, you know, all up in arms and was young and in college and didn't care and was yelling, hollering, screaming, doing whatever. And it's interesting to see it come full circle now. You know, I'm on the other side. You're in the system now. You're working within the system. So me running down the street and, you know, shirt off, yelling, hollering, and that's not my role. That's not my role at this point.
But there was a lot of passion in that, correct?
Right.
There was a lot of, you know, emotion. It meant something to you. I mean, that I can understand that.
So now you're in the system, and you're a little cautious. You speak your mind, but you do walk that line and try to make sure that since you're in the system and you're in it, that I need to make sure I stay in it, not put myself in a situation to be taken out of this role. So I really encourage those younger folks and those individuals that are in positions where they can speak outside of the system to speak up. But it's interesting when I look back at that younger 30-year-old Eugene, or Gene as they used to call me. It was a totally different person walking through the University of Cincinnati. So, but with that, I do want to say, does anybody else have anything to add? I really want to open it up for questions. Any of the panelists, do you have anything else before we open it up? So I want to say thank you so much for your time and contributions today. At this time, though, we're going to open it up to our virtual audience for some questions. If you have a question, please type your question in the chat box for us to read out, or unmute yourself to ask your question. And you can ask, that's open to all.
I wanted to know so I'm a Caucasian, so what would it look like for me to be empathetic versus, allyship?
I'll kick it off and then feel free to add. I'll go back to the idea of proximity and, who and how we choose to bring relationship into our lives. One of the simple tests that has been put out there is like, if you take a look at your last 10 text messages that weren't work related, how diverse is that set of people? And that's true for all of us. That's not just for white people. That'd be true for Black, Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander. We can find ourselves really surrounding ourselves with people who have a shared life experience and often a shared race. And so I think one of the things that we can often do is be intentional about how do we begin to build real deep connections with people who have a very different lived experience. And that would be one very, very simple step, but I think powerful step toward empathy with particularly the Black and Indigenous people of color struggle that's happening in our country right now.
I would like to also piggyback on that. I think that it's time to start having really good conversations with some of your friends that are different than you, to really connect with them and really hear what they have to say in certain instances. When you talk about racism, it's one of those topics for some people that I don't want to talk about that. I enjoy our friendship and what we do, when we go to the, church or whatever, but or other places. But that conversation is needed in order to really strengthen your bond and have a better understanding of what that person is going through.
It was a question on the chat line, and it was, how do we get our people to come in for help? Many of us are afraid to get help.
But what I have noticed is that this year has made people more willing to come in to help. I've had so many people just seek help on their own, and no one has had to coax them into it. I just think so many people are worn down and tired that they realize that they are kind of at their breaking point and they need help. And no one has had to push them into it. Unfortunately, 2020 has kind of pushed people into getting help who would not have gotten it before. And also because of COVID, so much treatment is available via telehealth now, and people don't even have to leave their house to get treatment. That's made it a lot easier, and no one even needs to know that you're getting treatment because you're getting it in your house, and that's made it a lot easier for people as well. So I think those are kind of two obstacles that have been broken and made it easier for people to seek treatment. But I think we also have to kind of just normalize mental health treatment. Your brain is part of your body. If any other part of your body needed help, you would get treatment. So if you had a broken bone, you would get it fixed. Your brain, if it's not working properly, you need to get help for that too. So we just need to normalize that mental health treatment is the same as physical health treatment, and there is no shame in getting help. So that's things that we need to not shame people for getting mental health treatment.
Definitely.
I just want to quickly double click on that too, because Dr. Johnson, you mentioned this earlier, and there's also a question in the chat from Tony that kind of gets at this. I'm a Black pastor. I grew up in the Black church. I don't pastor a Black church now, but I do know that there has often been a stigma in our spiritual circles around mental health. So let me just go on record by saying I'm a Black pastor, and I have a weekly appointment with a therapist. My wife and I have gone to marriage counseling multiple times in our 18 years of marriage and found it to be incredibly helpful. And so for people of faith who share my faith and may have that stigma, I just want to very clearly and boldly say, in places like 3 John, it says, I would that you would prosper and be in health, even as your soul prospers. And while we love talking about that in terms of material prosperity, that actually is talking about our inner life. And so what God wants for us, what the Creator wants for us, is an inner life that prospers. And He's given us counselors, just like He's given us surgeons, just like He's given us pediatricians and other things, vaccines, just like He's given us those things that enable us to thrive. And so I would encourage anyone who has grown up with that being a stigma in your faith expression, I would gently or maybe boldly push back on that and say it is absolutely right and healthy to get the care that you need for your mind.
I appreciate your transparency on that. That thing as far as reaching out for help and even going to therapy on every level is something I think a lot of us, we need to hear. We need to hear, especially those of us in the faith community. I know the Black church is one thing. Shh, you don't say that. Don't you say that.
That's right.
Speak out.
I'm saying it. I'm saying it loud. You can tell them I said it.
Do we have any other questions in the chat?
There are quite a few. This is Heather.
Okay.
Would you like Julia to read them, or?
Yeah, she can, please, because I don't see them all.
Okay. This question is for Pastor Mingo and Dr. Johnson. I'm an African-American clinical counselor in Ohio, and I often have African-American clients come to my office struggling with spiritual abuse and church hurt on top of systemic oppression, mental illness, and trauma, which are a few of many layers that affect African-Americans' views to receiving counseling. With multiple layers such as systemic racism, unjust treatment within the justice system, poor medical care, inadequate housing, low wages, etc. How do we get our people to cognitively restructure thinking when it comes to receiving therapy? How do we undo systemic generational trauma and recognize epigenetics in trauma? I guess you've answered some of it, but if you could take the rest, yeah. Thank you.
Dr. Johnson is on
She's
mute.
muted.
Yep.
Sorry.
There she
Yeah,
is.
I lost my video too. I'm trying to figure out how to get that back. So sorry about that. So I think in addition to what Pastor Mingo said, I think, okay, I think I got my video back. Okay. So I think undoing systemic and generational trauma, that is very difficult. I think the first step is to get people into the door, and how we talked about is just reducing the stigma about therapy in general. Once you're able to get people into the door, I think you have to identify the trauma sources. So systemic is just there for all of us, unfortunately, and generational. So I think the immediate issue is probably to deal with the person's individual trauma first, dealing with those layers initially, and then working on systemic and generational. I think unfortunately systemic and generational, that's like a community issue that we all have to deal with. That we as a community need to deal with, and that is, I don't know that I have the answer to that, unfortunately. That might be more than we even have for this conversation, unfortunately. I mean, as you know, that goes back to slavery. I'm at a loss for words on that one, quite honestly, but I think first we need to get people into the door for therapy, and that is reducing the stigma of therapy, and just, even Pastor Mingo mentioning that he gets therapy himself. That right there, knowing that people get therapy. Black people go to therapy, there is nothing wrong with it. people get therapy, there's nothing wrong with it. I think that's the most important message that we can give to people. And people seeing therapists that look like them, I know that people don't think that that's that big of a deal, but truly it is. Unfortunately, I think for some certain issues like generational trauma, systemic trauma, people do not always feel comfortable talking about that with someone who doesn't understand it. So being able to have a therapist who understands those issues is important as well. So for Tony, you being someone who understands that, that's important. So thank you for being available to your clients.
Are you adding to that, Pastor Mingo?
Sorry, no, I tried to address the faith component in my
Right.
earlier question. I was looking at that, so we
Okay.
can move on to another question.
Okay, thank you. The next question asks, I work with PATH Homeless Outreach. What are some things I can do to make the homeless safer and more heard?
She said the homeless, as far as dealing with the homeless.
Yes, yes.
Right. I think for that, I think they just need a voice. I think a lot of times with the homeless, they have different agency and different organizations as far as groups. I think we have to get, I think number one, we have to get individuals to speak up and speak out because they can't help themselves. When you look at a group of individuals where you have true mental illness and they're just not getting a lot of the support that they need. I know a lot of things are going on in Cincinnati where they're trying to get more finances and financial support and things of that nature. And that's one of the areas, whereas I think with the homeless, if we're gonna have an impact in that area, we're gonna definitely have to have more funds going towards the homeless agencies and funds to support and help the homeless. I think that is going to be a key. That is definitely going to be a key as far as financial backing and funding.
I'll add quickly to that and just say, I know I sound like a broken record, but I do believe in the power of proximity. So I'll keep bringing it up. And when it comes to the homeless, I think about a 9-year-old, yes, a 9-year-old in our community. Her name is Reese Smedley, and she's the daughter of a friend of mine. And she started an organization, a nonprofit called Reese's Hope. And they do care packages and they drop off those care packages to homeless people. And I think about the visibility that she's given to the issue of homelessness, the dignity that she's given to the homeless, and then families that come alongside for these experiences. Them and their children are having powerful experiences, which I think just rechange. And again, a lot of this we're talking about is stigma, right? There's a stigma that comes with homelessness, but I think that oftentimes there are powerful individual choices that we can also make to advance it forward. So I do think what you'll find in all of these is there's a need for systemic change, but then there's also that opportunity we have to personally step in and be a part of that change.
Okay, next question. I am a white therapist working in a predominantly Black elementary school. Several of the kids I work with have described internalized racism and talk about all Black people are X, Y, and Z. Suggestions for approaching the kids to make them aware of these internalized messages and helping them change those perceptions.
For being in a school system, I think this is huge. And I know for me coming up, when I graduated high school, in the history books, I didn't see a lot of people that looked like me. When they talked about Egyptians, I had no idea that they were people of African descent until I got to college. So I think it's always been huge to me. And I know even when I taught in the Mount Healthy school system, one of the major things I did as an African-American teacher, African-American history teacher, is I would always teach before slavery. And I think if you want, one of the things that we have to push is a lot of times what they're talking about now is we're erasing history, but it's not erasing history. We're trying to just add some, tell our story and not always his story. So for me, I think we have to start with teaching our African-American students, our kids, our Black boys and girls that, they were at one time kings and queens. And I think if you can go back to that and you can start some programming and some education along the lines of, in Africa, you had mathematics, you had physics, you had medicine. This was the cradle of earth, and this is where a lot of things came from, and it runs in your DNA. So if you come from kings and queens and you were able to make it through the Middle Passage, and then you were able to make it through slavery, what you have is strong enough to make it through anything. So all Black people are this, all Black people are that. No, all Black people can make it and will succeed, but they have to have some understanding of who they are internally. And I think that goes back to teaching truly who they are with the history of African Americans, and that's prior to slavery. That's going back to Egypt. That's going back to Africa, the mother of civilization, and talking about if they could do science and physics, and you have pyramids to this day that's still standing. I mean, that's something to be proud of, and that's something that we have to instill in our students. And I think that, for me personally, I think you start there, and you start with the education of who you truly are, and then you start taking pride in who you are and understand that, you know, you don't have to be a rapper, you don't have to be a singer or a dancer, but you can be a doctor, you can be a lawyer. That's who you are, and that's your destiny. And I think that's the main thing that we have to try to instill in our young Black students, young Black males and females.
I agree. And I think also when noticing that, just point out to them too, like, you know, why are you saying such negative things? You know, what makes you say this? And, you know, pointing out positive qualities about themselves too. And, you know, just making them say, okay, tell me 3 things you like about yourself. You know, just giving them an exercise of positivity. And because they might not even realize that they're saying those negative things. So really pointing it out and then making sure that they are able to point out some positive aspects about themselves as well.
Since we're running out of time, I'll quickly go over a couple of the questions. I'm a white physician. Can you give me directions on how to have a safe space for my my associates and me to talk about these issues?
Yeah, and I think, we did type in some answers about the psychologist, but I think just letting your patients know that, you know, I understand everything that's going on in the world right now, and I'm willing to listen. I think that's the most important thing. Just letting them know that, you know, you understand things are stressful, you understand that there's a lot of turmoil right now and it's probably affecting them, and I am willing to listen. And if I don't know what's going on, I'm willing to learn.
I also think, believe it or not, I think the pandemic in a way has helped this. I think through Zoom and Google Meets that people feel a little more comfortable having those conversations where you're not face to face, but you do have a safe space. You can sit in your house, in your room, and you can be on a call with over 100 people like today and have conversations and not be in a threatening situation. So I think in a way, learning to communicate via Zoom and Google Meets has helped and will continue to help those conversations. We have time for about one more question if we have one. Okay, we'll continue to answer them. Oh, go ahead.
Yes, I'll read a question that's a little different from some of the others. How do we deal with depression in our kids due to COVID and other media trauma in the world today? How do we keep them active and not reverting to the streets? I'm ending with this because this has not been addressed, and some of the other questions I've missed have been addressed in the panel at some point. So I apologize to the people who had those questions in earlier. Thank you.
And that question had to do with dealing with depression. Am I correct?
Correct. How do we deal with depression in our kids?
I'll leave that. Okay.
Well, actually, I was actually going to ask you, Eugene, if there was anything you all were doing in your schools in particular.
As far as in the schools, we do a lot of social and emotional learning. One of the things that's been, I think, important to us and what's helped out is we've have created classroom families and been able to try to, even with going remote and virtual, we still been having family time where students have opportunity. And it's almost what we talked about earlier, a safe space where individuals can come and they can just talk freely about how they're feeling and what they're going through. I know at the elementary and really all through from K through 12 here in North College Hill, we're trying to create those social and emotional groups and have discussion to try to deal with some of that depression, some of the things that students are going through. Also, we have situations where our counselors on heightened alert. So when we deal with situations, we try to get a referral to individual therapists to try to support and help our students and family. So that's one way that we've been dealing with it. But the one thing I think has been tremendously successful is the idea of creating social stories in those families and have a conversation at the beginning of school or at the beginning of the day with individuals, just to have time for them to talk and that sense of connectiveness with individuals, and that's helped us out a lot.
Yeah, that's very important. I think that's the most important thing is that, kids are definitely more isolated right now, of course, because of the social distancing from their friends. So making sure they have some kind of social contact, even if it's like a Zoom play date or whatever the case may be. And then also too, I think a lot of kids are keeping their feelings from their parents because they know their parents are stressed out. So they're like, well, I don't want to tell you what's going on with me because I know you're worried. So just making sure that your kids know that they can still talk to you. Even if you're stressed, that your kids know that they still have you to listen to them.
Thank you, definitely. Hey, we are, I hate to say it, I really do. We are just about out of time. So I would like to thank all of you in attendance today, but especially our panelists for your time and attention to this vital, important conversation. Racism is a public health crisis, and we must not forget the importance of mental health as we address this crisis. As the nation's largest grassroots mental health organization, it is NAMI's acknowledged responsibility to serve all. Again, it is NAMI's acknowledged responsibility to serve all. While still early in the intentional diversity, equity, and inclusion journey as an organization, NAMI has made a renewed commitment to these values and will continue to strive to deliver help, hope to all who need it. You are not alone. I invite you all to visit NAMI Southwest, I'm gonna say it just so we can get it out, NAMISWOW.org for biopic mental health resources and to learn more about how you can join the conversation and advocate for mental health for all. I want to say thank you. And again, I want to thank the panelists for your insight. And I want to thank everyone who tuned in today for this panel discussion. And we look to do many more great things with NAMI. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So helpful.
Thank you very much. Be blessed.